My name is Simone and I am 32 years old. During a lavish weekend family dinner, my stepmother stood up, clinked her crystal glass, and shouted for everyone to hear that I needed to give my master suite to my younger brother or get out of her house immediately. She called me a selfish spinster taking up space. I did not scream or cry. I simply smiled, wiped my mouth, packed my bags, and walked away into the night. 5 days later, I was sipping vintage red wine in my multi-million-dollar dream villa, while they were escorted off the property by armed federal agents. Before I dive into exactly how I orchestrated the ultimate revenge against my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain while secretly setting a trap for people who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta meant appearances were everything. Our family resided in a sprawling red brick estate in Buckhead. From the outside, it looked like the pinnacle of Black excellence and success. Inside it was a snake pit. The dining room was illuminated by a massive chandelier casting a warm glow over the mahogany table set for 12. That Sunday evening, the air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and the suffocating perfume of my stepmother Valerie. Valerie was 55 years old and completely obsessed with maintaining her image among Atlanta high society. She wore a tailored silk dress that probably cost a month of my father's salary, flashing diamond rings every time she reached for her wine glass. We were all gathered to celebrate the engagement of my 24-year-old half-brother Trey and his new fiancée Raven. Trey was the undisputed golden child of the family. He had never held down a real job for more than 6 months, but Valerie treated him like he was the heir to a royal throne. Raven was 23 years old and exactly the kind of woman Valerie loved. She was loud, obsessed with designer labels, and spent most of the dinner taking selfies for her social media followers. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, sipping my sparkling water and observing the spectacle. I had spent my entire life being the scapegoat of this family. Even though I had graduated at the top of my class from Spelman College and built a highly successful career in commercial real estate acquisitions, my family treated me like an invisible burden. I preferred quiet luxury over flashy cars and designer bags. They mistook my humility for failure. The dinner conversation was dominated by Raven, bragging about her upcoming wedding plans. She went on and on about the floral arrangements and the designer dress she had her eye on. My father Desmond sat at the head of the table, quietly cutting his steak. At 60 years old, my father was a shadow of the man he used to be. He had always been passive, but ever since he married Valerie, he had completely surrendered his spine. He never stood up for me. He simply existed in the background, letting Valerie run the household like a dictator. Suddenly, Valerie tapped her silver spoon against her crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter and the room fell silent. Valerie stood up, smoothing the front of her dress, and locked her eyes directly on me. Simone, she began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. As you all know, Trey and Raven are expecting a baby. The family legacy is expanding, and we need to make some adjustments around here to accommodate the new parents. Valerie continued, her tone shifting from sweet to authoritative. Raven needs a proper space for the nursery, and she needs good natural lighting for her mental health. Your room is an 800-square-foot master suite with the best view in the house. It is entirely too large for one person. You will be vacating that room by next week. You can move your things down to the basement or get out of my house entirely. The choice is yours. The silence in the dining room was deafening. I looked down the table at my biological father. Desmond did not even look up from his plate. He kept sawing at his piece of lamb, chewing slowly, as if his wife had not just ordered his eldest daughter into a damp, unfinished basement. I was choosing the path of least resistance, just as he always did. I turned my gaze to my older sister, Renee. Renee was 35 years old and carried a deep-seated bitterness toward me. She had married Jamal, a 38-year-old man who claimed to be a high-end financial broker but always seemed to be hustling for quick cash. Renee sneered at me, crossing her arms over her chest. Honestly, Simone, she said, rolling her eyes, you are 32 years old, single and childless. Why on earth do you need all that space anyway? It is embarrassing that you are even trying to hold on to a master suite when your brother is starting a real family. You should be happy to help them out. Jamal leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon. He always spoke with a false sense of authority, trying to sound like the smartest man in the room. Renee is right, Simone. Jamal chimed in with a passive-aggressive chuckle. This is about building the family legacy. You have always been selfish and disconnected from what this family needs. Trey needs that space to raise his child in a proper environment. You are just taking up valuable real estate for no reason. Do the right thing for once and step aside. Raven chimed in, giggling as she adjusted her engagement ring. Yeah, Simone, the basement is not that bad. I am sure you can make it cozy. Plus, I have already hired a luxury interior demolition crew to come in tomorrow morning and knock down the closet walls to build my custom nursery walk-in. So you really need to be out by tonight. They all stared at me, waiting for a reaction. They expected me to cry. They expected me to argue, defend myself, or beg my father to intervene. They wanted a show. They thrived on drama, and breaking my spirit gave them a sick sense of superiority. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. The years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the blatant favoritism, it all culminated in this ridiculous demand. I slowly picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth, and set it neatly beside my plate. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I looked at Valerie, who was standing tall, waiting for my tears. I looked at Trey, who was smirking at me. I looked at my father, who still refused to meet my eyes. I simply smiled. It was a calm, genuine smile that immediately made Valerie falter. Her confident posture stiffened as confusion crossed her face. I did not say a single word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I climbed the grand staircase to the master suite. Once inside, I did not panic. I pulled exactly 2 sleek suitcases from the closet. I packed my essential business documents, my laptop, tailored suits, and sentimental items. I left the furniture and clutter behind. I zipped the suitcases shut and rolled them down the stairs. The entire family was still sitting at the dining table, watching me with a mix of shock and arrogant amusement. I walked right up to the table. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out the heavy set of brass house keys, and tossed them onto the polished mahogany wood. The keys landed with a loud clatter. Take it, I said, my voice steady and smooth. Enjoy your stay. Trey burst into mocking laughter, slamming his hand on the table. Look at her running away. Let us see how long you survive on the streets, Simone. You will be begging to sleep in the basement by next week. I did not look back. I walked out the heavy doors and stepped into the Atlanta night. I loaded my suitcases into my car, started the engine, and drove down the long, winding driveway. As the red brick estate faded in my rearview mirror, I let out a deep breath. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied the weak link of the family out of her home. They had absolutely no idea that I had just handed them the rope they would use to hang themselves. I was driving toward my actual primary residence, a sprawling modern villa in the most exclusive zip code in the city. And as I merged onto the highway, I knew the invisible timer on a massive financial trap had just been set. The very next morning at the Buckhead estate began with the deafening roar of heavy diesel trucks pulling into the circular driveway. It was barely 8 o'clock, but Trey and Raven were already wide awake, vibrating with the arrogant energy of conquerors who had just claimed a new territory. Raven strutted around the grand foyer in a silk robe, holding a steaming mug of artisanal coffee, barking orders at the team of luxury interior demolition specialists Trey had hired on an exorbitant line of credit. They were not just changing the paint color or ripping up the carpet. They wanted to rip out the custom-built walk-in closets, knock down the load-bearing walls separating the sitting area, and install a massive nursery fit for the fictional royalty they believed themselves to be. Raven held her phone high, capturing every moment for her social media followers. Her perfectly manicured fingernails tapped the screen as she started an Instagram live stream to broadcast their triumph. Welcome to the new master suite, y'all, Raven chirped, her voice echoing through the high ceilings of the mansion. We finally kicked the dead-weight sister out of the family house. It is out with the old broke energy, and in with the new luxury baby wing. Watch us transform this dusty spinster room into an absolute palace. This family only has room for winners. Trey stood in the background, flexing his arms and nodding at the camera, completely oblivious to the financial and legal avalanche they were standing directly underneath. He clapped his hands loudly, urging the workers to move faster, treating the expensive property like it was his personal playground. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, in the ultra-exclusive neighborhood of Tuxedo Park, I was waking up to the gentle hum of my automated blackout blinds rising to reveal a panoramic view of my private infinity pool. My actual home was a sleek, minimalist glass and steel villa that I owned free and clear. I stepped onto the heated marble floors of my actual master bedroom, wrapped myself in a cashmere robe, and headed down to my state-of-the-art kitchen to brew a fresh espresso. I sat at my massive quartz island and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated my inbox filled with high-level commercial real estate acquisition contracts. I had graduated at the top of my class from Spelman College, a fact my family loved to ignore because I did not use my degree to marry a rich man. Instead, I used it to become the wealthy entity they all pretended to be. I spent the last 10 years ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder, mastering the art of distressed property acquisitions, and building a commercial real estate portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. I kept my massive wealth entirely hidden from my status-obsessed family. I knew exactly how they operated. I knew that if Valerie or Jamal ever caught wind of my actual net worth, they would swarm me like vultures, demanding I fund their extravagant lifestyles and cover their endless debts. It was much easier to let them believe I was a struggling single woman doing entry-level clerical work. It kept their greed directed elsewhere, and it gave me the ultimate upper hand. I took a sip of my espresso, reviewed a $50 million commercial plaza acquisition in downtown Atlanta, and smiled to myself. I did not need their validation. I held the actual power, and more importantly, I held the deeds. Back at the Buckhead estate, the destruction was officially underway. Sledgehammers slammed into the drywall of my former bedroom, sending thick plumes of white dust billowing out into the grand hallway. The demolition crew ripped out the custom oak shelving and tore up the imported hardwood floors with crowbars. Valerie stood at the top of the staircase, holding a delicate cup of herbal tea, watching the chaos with a look of supreme satisfaction. She felt she had finally secured her bloodline dominance over my father and his house. Renee and Jamal arrived shortly after carrying a box of expensive gourmet pastries to celebrate the renovation. Renee peeked into the dusty room, coughing slightly, but smiling maliciously at the wreckage of my former sanctuary. "It is about time someone put that massive space to good use," Renee remarked, brushing a speck of dust off her designer jacket. Simone never appreciated what this family offered her anyway. She always acted so superior, but look at her now sleeping on some cheap mattress somewhere. Jamal nodded, pulling out his latest smartphone to check his stock portfolio apps, which were perpetually showing massive losses. "We just needed to clear out the negative energy," Jamal added, smoothly adjusting his tie. "This house represents the family legacy. It is only right that Trey takes over the best rooms to raise his heir. We are building generational wealth here, and you cannot let dead weight hold the family back." The irony of his statement was staggering, considering Jamal had not closed a legitimate financial deal in over 2 years and relied entirely on high-interest loans to fund his flashy wardrobe. Raven continued filming the destruction, directing the workers like they were her personal servants. "Knock that whole wall down," Raven instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the partition separating the bedroom from the hallway. "I want an open concept flow, so the baby can have maximum natural light. My followers are going to die when they see the before and after of this renovation." But arrogance often blinds people to reality, and reality was about to hit them like a freight train. Downstairs, the heavy wooden front doors swung open, and the general contractor for the demolition crew walked in. He was a burly, no-nonsense man named Derek, who had spent 30 years navigating the strict housing regulations and zoning laws of Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhoods. He wiped his heavy work boots on the expensive Persian rug and marched straight up the grand staircase. His face was set in a hard line, and he held a thick metal clipboard tightly in his right hand. He waved his hand aggressively, signaling his crew to cut the power to their electric saws. The deafening noise ground to an abrupt halt, leaving a ringing silence in the dusty hallway. "What is going on?" Raven demanded, lowering her phone and glaring at the contractor. "I did not tell them to stop working. We are on a very tight schedule here. I need this room gutted by tomorrow morning for the interior designers. The contractor ignored Raven completely and looked directly at Valerie, who was clearly acting as the matriarch of the house. Ma'am, I need to see the approved Homeowners Association permits and the signed authorization from the legal property owner, Derek stated firmly, tapping his heavy pen against his clipboard. We cannot take down load-bearing walls in this neighborhood without submitting the architectural blueprints to the HOA board and getting a verified signature from the deed holder on file. My guys cannot do another ounce of work until I have that paperwork in my hand. It is standard legal procedure for any major renovation in Buckhead. Valerie rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh of intense annoyance. She walked over to the contractor, radiating a false sense of elite superiority. Do you have any idea who we are? Valerie asked, her tone dripping with condescension and entitlement. This is the family estate. My husband Desmond is the patriarch of this family and the sole owner of this massive house. We do not need to jump through annoying bureaucratic hoops just to knock down a few interior walls in our own home. We are practically royalty in this subdivision. Just give me the paperwork and I will sign it for him. He is resting in his study right now and absolutely cannot be disturbed by minor construction details. Valerie reached out and aggressively snatched the clipboard from the contractor's hands. She confidently scribbled Desmond's name on the bottom line, not even bothering to read the legal disclaimers and financial liabilities listed above the signature block. She shoved the clipboard back against the contractor's chest, expecting him to bow his head, apologize, and order his men back to work immediately. There, Valerie scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest and raising her chin. The homeowner has signed your little permission slip. Now get back to work before I decide to take my business to another company and ruin your reputation with everyone in my country club. The contractor did not flinch. He looked down at the forged signature on his clipboard and then looked back up at Valerie with a slow, realizing gaze. He pulled a small digital tablet from his tool belt and tapped the screen a few times, bringing up the county public property records. He was a professional who never took risks with liability issues on high-end residential projects. Ma'am, Derek said, his voice dropping to a serious, unamused register. I do not care what country club you belong to. I check the Fulton County Property Registry before I start any major demolition job to ensure my company is protected from liability lawsuits. He turned the tablet around and held it up right in front of Valerie's face. The screen clearly displayed the official legal deed for the estate. Desmond is not the legal owner of this property. Valerie squinted at the screen, her confident smirk beginning to waver. She adjusted her posture, trying to maintain her authoritative aura, but the words on the digital county record were undeniable. The contractor tapped the bold printed text at the very top of the deed document. This house is owned by a private commercial entity, Derek stated loudly, ensuring that Trey, Raven, Renee, and Jamal could hear every single word. And unless your husband is the registered agent of this specific holding company, this signature you just forged is completely legally invalid. My crew is packing up our tools right now. We are leaving, and we will not be back until the actual legal owner of this property contacts my office directly with the proper authorizations. Valerie's face flushed a deep, angry red as the reality of the situation began to settle over the dusty hallway. The arrogant destruction of the master suite had just come to a grinding, humiliating halt. Valerie snatched the tablet from the contractor's hands, staring at the digital records as if the glowing screen were actively insulting her. The name listed under the property owner was Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC. There was no mention of Desmond. There was no mention of the family trust she had bragged about at her elite social gatherings. Derek signaled his crew with a sharp whistle, and within minutes the heavy boots of the demolition team echoed down the grand staircase, leaving behind a cloud of drywall dust and exposed wooden beams. Trey and Raven stood frozen amidst the debris of my former bedroom. Raven lowered her phone hastily, ending her live broadcast before her thousands of followers could witness the humiliation. This has to be a clerical error, Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. She thrust the tablet back at Derek as he walked past her. My husband built this house. We have lived here for 15 years. You are looking at a glitch in the county system. I am looking at the law, ma'am, Derek replied without looking back, Take it up with the city. The heavy front doors slammed shut, echoing through the cavernous foyer. Valerie spun around her designer heels, clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she marched toward the mahogany double doors of Desmond's study. Trey, Renee, Jamal, and Raven followed closely behind a parade of entitlement, suddenly threatened by a reality they could not comprehend. Valerie threw the study doors open. Desmond was sitting in his plush leather wingback chair, a glass of scotch resting on the desk, reading a golf magazine. He looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. Desmond, what on earth is Vanguard Horizon Holdings? Valerie demanded, slamming her hands onto his immaculate desk. Why did the contractor just leave? Why is the county registry showing that a commercial corporation owns our estate instead of you? Desmond's face went completely ashen. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking incredibly old and fragile. He set his magazine down, his hands visibly shaking. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic stutter escaped his lips. Jamal pushed his way to the front of the group, his fraudulent financial radar instantly activated. "Hold on," Jamal said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at his father-in-law. "When you refinanced the house a few years ago, did you transfer the deed to a shell company for tax purposes? You told us you were setting up an irrevocable family trust." Desmond started wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I can explain." "Explain what?" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket, her manicured fingers aggressively dialing the Fulton County Clerk office. She put the phone on speaker and slammed it onto the desk right in front of Desmond. The phone rang twice before a bored-sounding clerk answered. "Fulton County Property Records, how can I assist you?" the clerk asked. "My name is Valerie, and I need to verify the deed on my property right now," Valerie demanded, practically leaning over the desk to yell into the speaker. "The address is 4500 Blackland Road in Buckhead. There is a ridiculous error in your system showing a commercial entity owns my home." There was the sound of keyboard clacking on the other end of the line. The family held their collective breath. Desmond closed his eyes, completely defeated. "Ma'am," the clerk said, her voice flat and professional, "there is no error. The property at 4500 Blackland Road was officially foreclosed on by Southern Heritage Bank exactly 3 years ago due to severe mortgage default. The property was then purchased at a private auction by Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC. They paid the outstanding tax liens in full and hold the absolute legal title. Desmond is no longer the owner. In fact, according to this, nobody with your last name has held any equity in that property for 36 months. Valerie stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of leather-bound books. Raven gasped, covering her mouth. Trey looked furiously between his father and the phone. Jamal was doing mental calculations, trying to figure out how a multi-million-dollar asset had slipped through his fingers. "Thank you," Valerie managed to say before hanging up the phone. She turned her piercing glare onto her husband. "Foreclosed. 3 years ago. You told me we were perfectly fine. You told me the business was thriving. I was trying to keep us afloat." Valerie, Desmond pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his long-held secret. "You wanted the country club memberships. You wanted the European vacations. You insisted on hosting those lavish charity galas to impress your socialite friends. The business took a massive hit during the market downturn, and I took out a second mortgage to cover our lifestyle. Then I took out a third. The bank called in the loans. We were going to be evicted. We were going to lose everything and end up on the street." Renee threw her hands in the air. "So you just lost our family inheritance so your wife could buy more designer shoes and throw parties for people who do not even like us?" Valerie whipped her head around, glaring at her stepdaughter. "Do not you dare put this on me, Renee. He is the man of the house. He should have managed the finances better." Jamal stepped between them, holding up his hands. "Stop arguing about the past. We have a much bigger problem right now. If a commercial holding company bought the banknote 3 years ago, why have they let us live here rent-free? Why has nobody come to evict us? Corporate landlords do not run charities. Someone bought this house specifically to let Desmond stay in it." The room went dead silent. The realization hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jamal quickly pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he accessed the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry. He typed in Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC. He scrolled past the registered agent information and found the primary managing partner. His jaw dropped. Jamal looked up slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He turned the phone screen toward the family. The registered owner and primary managing partner of Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC is Simone. What Trey yelled, snatching the phone from Jamal's hand. That is impossible. She is just a low-level clerk. She wears cheap clothes and drives an ordinary sedan. There is no way she had the capital to buy a foreclosure in Buckhead. Desmond let out a ragged breath, finally confessing the ultimate truth. She is not a clerk, Trey. Simone is a senior managing partner at one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the Southeast. She has been making millions for years. When the bank issued the final eviction notice 3 years ago, I went to her begging for help. I was terrified of Valerie finding out we were broke. Simone used her company to quietly buy the banknote and pay off all the outstanding property taxes. She did it to keep me from being homeless. She told me I could live here for the rest of my life as long as I maintained the property. Valerie's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. So she owns the house, the girl I just kicked out, the girl whose room I just ordered demolished. She owns 100% of this estate. Yes, Desmond whispered, staring at his hands. Legally, we are nothing more than non-paying squatters living under her roof. If she wanted to, she could have thrown us out 3 years ago. Any normal family would have felt a profound sense of shame, or at least a shred of gratitude. Any decent human being would have realized that the woman they relentlessly bullied, mocked, and ostracized had secretly been their savior. But this was not a normal family. They were a collection of narcissists obsessed with status and entitlement. Instead of remorse, the revelation bred an intense toxic wave of greed and resentment. Renee paced the floor, her heels stomping aggressively. So she has been sitting on millions of dollars this whole time while watching us struggle. Jamal has been trying to get his financial brokerage off the ground, and she could have easily funded it. She let us treat her like a burden when she had the power to elevate this entire family. That is incredibly selfish. Trey kicked a leather footstool, sending it skidding across the room. She probably bought the house just to hold it over our heads. She wants us to feel like her peasants. That is why she smiled when she handed over the keys. She knew she had all the power. We cannot let her get away with this. I am supposed to be raising my son in this house. This is my legacy, not hers. Valerie's eyes narrowed, her mind rapidly shifting from shock to malicious calculation. She refused to accept that her high society lifestyle was entirely dependent on the charity of the stepdaughter she despised. She refused to be a guest in her own supposed kingdom. She looked at Jamal, her eyes glinting with a dangerous, predatory light. Jamal, Valerie said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. You are a financial expert. There has to be a loophole. Desmond is her biological father. He lived in this house for over a decade before she bought the note. We have squatter rights. We have marital asset rights. She manipulated a desperate old man into signing over his equity. That is elder abuse. Jamal adjusted his suit jacket, his fraudulent mind already spinning a web of illegal schemes. He smelled blood in the water. If Simone had millions sitting in holding companies, there was a way to extract it. We just need to play this smart. Jamal said, a sinister smile spreading across his face. She may own the paper, but we have physical possession of the property. And more importantly, we know exactly how to use the legal system to tie up her assets. We are not leaving this house. In fact, we are going to take it back. Raven, who had been silent since the contractor left, finally spoke up. Good, because I already ordered custom Italian crib furniture, and it is being delivered next week. I am not raising my baby in a basement, and I am certainly not letting that arrogant spinster kick us out. We need to destroy her before she tries to evict us. Desmond sat quietly in his chair, watching his family plot against the daughter who had literally kept a roof over their heads. He did not say a word to defend me. He simply poured himself another glass of scotch and let the wolves scheme. The truth had been revealed, but instead of bringing the family together, it had ignited a war. They felt entitled to my wealth, my property, and my success. They thought they could outsmart me in a game I had been playing professionally for a decade. They were perfectly willing to destroy me to maintain their fraudulent high society facade. But they were completely oblivious to the fact that their intense greed was exactly what I was counting on. I knew my stepmother and my brother-in-law better than they knew themselves. I knew that discovering my wealth would not make them humble, it would make them reckless. They were about to make a series of desperate illegal moves to try and seize control of my assets. And as I sat in my luxury villa reviewing the hidden cameras I had installed in the Buckhead estate hallways, I watched them plotting their own demise. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. I just had to wait for Jamal to make his first fatal mistake. The incubation of that mistake took less than 4 hours. Inside the suffocating walls of the Buckhead estate, the atmosphere had shifted from arrogant celebration to toxic desperation. Valerie paced the length of the mahogany study, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. The realization that she was a guest in my house gnawed at her ego like a physical parasite. She could not fathom returning to her elite country club luncheons, knowing she held no equity, no power, and no legacy. She poured herself a generous measure of Desmond's top-shelf scotch, her hands trembling with indignation. Jamal stood near the towering bay windows, staring out at the manicured lawn he had falsely claimed as part of his family portfolio just days prior. His mind was a chaotic ledger of overdue loans, margin calls, and angry investors. Jamal had spent the last 5 years parading around Atlanta as a high-net-worth financial broker, but his reality was built on a house of cards. He drove a leased Maserati, wore tailored suits bought on maxed-out credit cards, and desperately needed a massive cash injection to keep his fraudulent lifestyle afloat. Trey's upcoming extravagant wedding was supposed to be his networking goldmine, but now the very foundation of their wealth had been ripped away. Valerie stopped pacing and locked her sharp, calculating eyes on Jamal. She knew exactly how to play him. She walked over, handing him a crystal glass of scotch, her voice dropping to a smooth, manipulative purr. "Desmond is weak," Jamal, Valerie hissed, casting a disgusted glare at the empty chair where my father had been sitting earlier. "He let that deceitful girl steal this estate right out from under us. He has no spine. But you, Jamal, you understand how the financial world works. You are the only real man in this family right now. We cannot let Simone humiliate us like this." Jamal straightened his posture, drinking in the validation. His fragile ego swelled instantly. He took a slow sip of the scotch, his mind racing to formulate a plan that would benefit him directly. "What is in it for me?" Valerie, Jamal asked, dropping the family-first facade. "If I fix this, if I force Simone to surrender the deed, I need capital. I need a significant cut of the equity to expand my brokerage." Valerie did not miss a beat. "Get the deed transferred into my name by the end of the week, and I will let you take out whatever loans you need against the house. We split the equity. You get your capital and I get my kingdom back." A sinister, arrogant smile spread across Jamal's face. He set his glass down with a definitive thud. He genuinely believed I was just a lucky amateur, a glorified real estate agent who had stumbled into a fortunate transaction. Because I had stayed silent at the dinner table when Valerie kicked me out, Jamal equated my composure with weakness. He assumed I lacked the ruthless edge required to fight a legal battle. He thought he could break me with aggressive intimidation. "Leave it to me," Jamal said confidently. "I deal with corporate sharks every day. Simone is nothing but a scared little girl playing with big money. By tomorrow morning, she will be begging to sign this house over to us just to stay out of a federal courtroom." While Jamal and Valerie were busy plotting their imaginary victory, I was experiencing absolute tranquility. I was sitting on the expansive terrace of my Tuxedo Park villa, bathed in the warm afternoon sun. The gentle sound of water cascading from my infinity pool provided the perfect acoustic backdrop for reviewing my commercial acquisition contracts. I wore a plush cashmere lounge set, a stark contrast to the uncomfortable, restrictive designer suits my family forced themselves into just to sit in their living room. My private chef had just brought out a plate of fresh bruschetta and a glass of chilled Sauvignon Blanc. I was the picture of unbothered luxury. Right on schedule, my encrypted personal phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Jamal's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I cleared my throat, physically relaxing my shoulders, and prepared to deliver an Oscar-worthy performance. I tapped the screen to answer. Hello, I said, making sure to pitch my voice slightly higher, injecting a subtle tremor of hesitation into my tone. Simone listened to me very carefully. Because I am only going to say this once, Jamal barked through the speaker. His voice was unnecessarily loud, dripping with manufactured authority. He was using his best aggressive broker persona, trying to establish immediate dominance. Jamal, what is going on? Is Dad okay? I asked, letting my breath hitch perfectly. Do not play stupid with me. Jamal snapped, his hostility escalating. We know exactly what you did, Simone. We know about Vanguard Horizon Holdings. We know you slithered behind our backs and manipulated a desperate, confused old man into signing away his equity. You took advantage of your own father when he was in a vulnerable mental state. I did not manipulate anyone, Jamal. I pleaded, letting my voice waver, as if I were on the verge of tears. The bank was going to throw him out on the street. I paid the debt to save the house. I just wanted to help him. Save the house! Do not make me laugh! Jamal yelled, leaning into the intimidation tactics Valerie had surely coached him on. You stole a multi-million-dollar asset from this family. You committed elder financial abuse, Simone. That is a felony. I have been on the phone with my legal team all morning. Do you have any idea what the district attorney does to people who defraud the elderly? They seize your assets, they freeze your bank accounts, and they lock you up. You are looking at a decade in federal prison. I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. Jamal was throwing around legal buzzwords with absolute reckless abandon. Elder financial abuse applies to manipulating a senior citizen into changing a will or draining their personal retirement accounts. I had bought a distressed commercial banknote directly from Southern Heritage Bank at a public auction, completely independent of my father's input. The transaction was a textbook corporate acquisition, bulletproof and heavily audited. Jamal's threats were legally illiterate, but I knew exactly what he needed to hear. No, please, Jamal, you cannot do that. I stammered, artificially raising the pitch of my voice to sound frantic. I did not break the law. Everything was done through an LLC. I am a licensed professional. A lawsuit like that would destroy my entire career. Please, you do not understand what this would do to my reputation. Oh, I understand perfectly, Jamal sneered, his arrogance peaking. He had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. I can make all of this go away, Simone. I can call off the lawyers and keep the authorities out of it, but you are going to do exactly what I say. You are going to draft a quitclaim deed transferring 100% of the property ownership directly into Valerie's name. You will email me the signed and notarized documents by the end of business today. You manipulate a confused old man. Transfer the deed into Valerie's name today, or I am filing a lawsuit for elder financial abuse right now. Jamal, please, I cannot just sign over a multi-million-dollar corporate asset by the end of the day. I whimpered, sounding breathless and utterly defeated. The holding company has bylaws. I need time. I do not want to go to jail, but you have to give me a few days to figure out how to untangle the paperwork. I just did not mean to cause trouble for the family. Please, just give me some time to fix this. I am not playing games with you, Simone, Jamal growled, sensing victory. You have 24 hours. If I do not have a legally binding transfer of deed on my desk by tomorrow evening, I am calling the authorities and I am burning your little real estate career to the ground. Tick-tock, little sister. Jamal slammed the phone down, ending the call with dramatic flair. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The terrified, trembling facade vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory smirk. I set the phone face down on the marble table, picked up my glass of wine, and took a long, deeply satisfying sip. Jamal's ego was a beautiful, predictable mechanism. By displaying absolute terror and begging for time, I had confirmed his massive superiority complex. I gave him a vague, non-committal answer. I did not say no, but I did not say yes. I left him in a state of suspended anticipation. I knew that Jamal, drowning in secret debts and eager to prove his worth to Valerie, would not have the patience to wait for me to untangle the corporate bylaws. He needed that equity immediately to save his own skin and fund Trey's ridiculous lifestyle. My calculated silence was the ultimate bait. By refusing to deliver the documents, but acting too paralyzed by fear to fight back, I had created a vacuum of power. Jamal was greedy, arrogant, and legally incompetent. He would convince himself that since I was too terrified to go to the authorities, I would be too terrified to report a forged document. He would look at the 24-hour deadline he had set, realize he could not wait, and decide to take the shortcut. I leaned back against the plush cushions of my outdoor sofa, listening to the gentle breeze rustle through the pristine landscaping of my estate. I had just handed a desperate, morally bankrupt man the exact psychological push he needed to cross the line from family bully to federal criminal. I did not need to lift a finger to destroy them. Jamal was going to do all the heavy lifting for me. Less than 24 hours after our phone call, Jamal found himself sitting in the driver's seat of his leased Maserati, dripping with a cold, nervous sweat. He was parked in the back corner of a dimly lit parking garage in downtown Atlanta, far away from the prying eyes of the Buckhead elite. His smartphone buzzed relentlessly in the cup holder, flashing messages from unlisted numbers. These were not his usual country club associates. These were the aggressive offshore bookies who held the markers on his massive underground gambling debts. Jamal had spent the last 2 years chasing the illusion of immense wealth, placing catastrophic bets on high-stakes sports games and offshore poker tables. He had leveraged everything he did not actually own to maintain his pristine image. Now the bill was past due, and the people he owed were not the type to send polite collection letters. They sent enforcers. On top of his mounting underground debts, the pressure from inside the family estate was reaching a boiling point. Valerie was breathing down his neck, demanding a solution to the property deed crisis. Trey and Raven were throwing massive tantrums about their disrupted nursery renovations and the upcoming engagement party. They had already invited 200 socialites to attend. Jamal knew that if the family was exposed as broke squatters, his own marriage to Renee would implode and his fragile status in Atlanta high society would evaporate overnight. He needed cash immediately. A massive, untraceable injection of liquidity to pay off his bookies fund, Trey's ridiculous engagement party, and keep the family illusion alive. He thought back to our phone call. He remembered my trembling voice and my desperate pleas for time. In his arrogant mind, my fear was a guaranteed green light. He convinced himself that I was nothing more than a terrified amateur who had stumbled into real estate. He genuinely believed I was sitting in my apartment, paralyzed by the threat of a fake elder abuse lawsuit, too terrified to contact any authorities. Jamal concluded that since I was too scared to defend myself, I would be entirely too terrified to report a fraudulent document. His greed completely eclipsed his rational judgment. Jamal pulled a thick manila folder from the passenger seat. Inside was a blank power of attorney document he had downloaded from a generic legal website. He had spent the previous evening filling in the corporate details for Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC, naming himself as the primary authorized agent with full executive powers to manage, encumber, or liquidate the assets of the company. The only thing missing was my signature. Jamal pulled an expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket. He did not even hesitate. He did not pause to consider the catastrophic legal boundaries he was about to cross. With a steady hand, he deliberately forged my signature on the bottom line, executing a perfect imitation of the handwriting he had seen on my old college documents. I even stamped it with a fake notary seal he had procured from a shady contact in the financial district. With a single stroke of his pen, Jamal transitioned from a pathetic family bully to a legitimate federal criminal. He had just committed felony forgery, but in his delusion he felt like an absolute genius. Armed with the forged power of attorney, Jamal immediately went to work securing his lifeline. He knew traditional banks would take weeks to underwrite a mortgage involving a commercial holding company. They would require extensive background checks, corporate bylaws, and direct verbal confirmations from the managing partners. Jamal could not risk that level of scrutiny. Instead, he turned to the shadow banking sector. He contacted a private hard money lending firm known for funding high-risk real estate deals with minimal questions asked, as long as the collateral was solid. The Buckhead estate was worth millions, making a $300,000 cash-out mortgage look like a highly lucrative, incredibly safe bet for any private lender. Jamal drove to a sketchy title company on the outskirts of the city. He presented the forged power of attorney and the property deed records to a loan officer who was eager to close a fast deal and secure a massive commission. Jamal confidently signed the closing disclosures, the promissory note, and the mortgage lien documents acting as the authorized representative of Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC. He requested that the $300,000 be wired directly into an offshore shell account. He controlled hiding the funds behind layers of corporate anonymity. He walked out of that title office feeling invincible. He had successfully stolen equity from my company and secured the cash he needed to save his life and fund his family delusions. What Jamal failed to realize was the fatal flaw in his brilliant master plan. In the commercial real estate sector, the major players are all connected. The private hard money lending firm he had chosen for its quick underwriting process was not an independent operation. It was a boutique subsidiary of the massive commercial real estate conglomerate, where I sat on the executive board as a senior managing partner. The following morning, I arrived at my sleek glass-walled corner office in Midtown Atlanta. The view of the skyline was breathtaking, but my focus was entirely on the thick encrypted file resting in the center of my desk. My executive assistant walked in carrying a fresh espresso and a slight smirk. She was fully aware of my ongoing family situation, and she managed my subsidiary portfolios with ruthless efficiency. "Good morning, Simone," my assistant said, tapping the file. The underwriting team at our private lending subsidiary flagged a high-risk cash-out mortgage application last night. Normally, the subsidiary directors handle these, but this specific application listed Vanguard Horizon Holdings, LLC as the collateral asset. The system automatically diverted the final approval process directly to your desk, since you are the registered owner of the holding company. I took a slow sip of my espresso, savoring the bitter richness. "Perfect," I said, opening the file. "Let us see what kind of creative writing my brother-in-law has been up to." I flipped through the pages of the loan application. There it was in black and white. Jamal had submitted a deeply fraudulent application requesting $300,000 in equity extracted from my Buckhead property. I pulled out the power of attorney document and examined the signature. It was a decent forgery, but legally it was a smoking gun. He had attached his own driver license, his personal banking details for the wire transfer, and his signed declarations, verifying under penalty of perjury that all information provided was true and accurate. He had beautifully documented his own felony. If I rejected the loan application right then, the fraud would remain an internal matter. Jamal would simply get a denial letter, and he might panic and try a different lender. I did not want him to try a different lender. I wanted him to feel secure. I wanted him to take the money and spend it, because the moment those stolen funds crossed state lines into his offshore account, the crime would escalate into a massive federal offense. The jurisdiction would shift from a local property dispute to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I picked up my favorite gold-plated pen. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. For years, Jamal and my sister Renee had mocked my lifestyle, belittled my career, and treated me like an insignificant peasant. They had stood by and laughed while Valerie ordered me out of my own house. Now Jamal had handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy their entire fraudulent existence. I flipped to the final executive authorization page. I signed my actual legal signature approving the disbursement of the $300,000. I authorized the wire transfer to leave the subsidiary lending accounts and hit Jamal's fraudulent shell account immediately. Process the wire transfer. I instructed my assistant, handing the file back to her. Make sure the funds clear his account by noon today. And immediately forward the entire application package, the forged power of attorney, the wire transfer receipts, and the property deed to our corporate legal team. Tell them to draft a comprehensive report for the United States Attorney's Office. My assistant smiled, taking the file. Wire fraud and deed fraud. That carries a mandatory minimum sentence, does it not? Yes, it does, I replied, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair. When you forge a signature to extract equity from a property you do not own, that is deed fraud. When you use the electronic banking system to transfer those stolen funds, that is federal wire fraud. Jamal just bought himself a one-way ticket to federal prison, and he thinks he just won the lottery. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, my phone pinged with an automated alert from the lending subsidiary. The $300,000 had been successfully transferred and accepted by Jamal Bank. The trap had officially snapped shut. Jamal had the cash. He was completely unaware of who really backed the loan or who had personally authorized his illicit payday. In his mind, he had outsmarted the system and secured his position as the savior of the family. He was going to use my money to pay off his dangerous gambling debts and fund the most extravagant engagement party Atlanta high society had ever seen. I was going to parade around my property, bragging about his financial genius. I intended to let him enjoy his delusion for just a few more days. The higher they climbed, the harder the impact would be when I finally pulled the ground out from under them. That very same afternoon, Jamal strutted back into the Buckhead estate with the swagger of a victorious warlord. He bypassed the grand foyer and marched directly into my father's study, where Valerie and Desmond were engaged in a tense, whispered argument about their impending homelessness. Jamal did not knock. He kicked the heavy mahogany door open and slammed his smartphone down on the center of Desmond's immaculate desk. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying his offshore banking application. In bold green numbers, the account balance showed exactly $300,000 newly deposited and fully cleared. Valerie stopped mid-sentence. She stared at the screen, her eyes widening as the numerical reality washed over her. She picked up the phone, clutching it like a winning lottery ticket. Jamal buttoned his tailored suit jacket and flashed a wide, predatory grin. He looked at my father with absolute contempt, fully embracing his new role as the financial savior of the family. "I told you I would fix it!" Jamal boasted, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "Your oldest daughter is not the corporate mastermind she pretends to be. She is just a scared little girl playing dress-up in the real estate market. I found a massive loophole in her LLC bylaws. I executed a sophisticated legal maneuver and forced her to surrender a chunk of the property equity back to the rightful owners. We just extracted $300,000 directly from her holding company. The house is secure, and we have the capital we need to maintain the family legacy." It was a blatant, absolute lie. There was no legal maneuver, and there was no loophole. Jamal had committed federal forgery, but his ego demanded that he frame his felony as an act of sheer financial genius. He needed Valerie to worship him, and he needed Desmond to feel small. Desmond looked at the bank balance and let out a long, trembling sigh of relief. A man with any shred of integrity would have questioned how Jamal managed to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars from a hostile corporate entity in less than 24 hours. A decent father would have called his daughter to verify the transaction. But Desmond was a coward. I was terrified of Valerie and terrified of losing his pristine public image. He chose the path of deliberate ignorance. He desperately wanted to believe that Jamal had legally outsmarted me because it meant he did not have to face the shame of his own bankruptcy. He sank back into his leather chair, nodding slowly, completely accepting the delusion they were feeding him. "We beat her!" Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with manic euphoria. She threw her arms around Jamal, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I knew you could do it, Jamal. I knew you were the only real man in this family." She is probably sitting in her cheap apartment right now, crying over her lost equity. We finally put that arrogant, spineless girl exactly where she belongs. The false victory injected a lethal dose of hubris directly into the veins of the family. They were entirely blinded by greed, completely ignoring the logical impossibilities of their situation. With $300,000 of stolen federal funds burning a hole in their accounts, they immediately embarked on a catastrophic spending spree to resurrect their fake affluent lifestyle. Jamal took his cut first. He retreated to the guest bedroom, locked the door, and opened his encrypted laptop. His hands were shaking with adrenaline as he accessed his offshore accounts. He immediately wired $150,000 to the shadowy overseas bookies who held his gambling markers. Within minutes, he received a short text message confirming the debts were cleared and the enforcers were called off. The relief was intoxicating. Jamal felt invincible. He had successfully stolen from a multi-million-dollar corporation and paid off his dangerous underworld debts without a single consequence. To celebrate his own perceived brilliance, he drove straight to a luxury watch boutique in Phipps Plaza and purchased a $40,000 solid gold Rolex. He strapped it to his wrist, a gleaming monument to his own impending federal indictment. Valerie seized control of the remaining funds with aggressive enthusiasm. She had a score to settle with the Atlanta high society women who had begun to whisper about her family's declining financial status. She decided that Trey and Raven's engagement party would not just be a celebration, it would be a weaponized display of absolute wealth. She hired the most expensive event planning firm in the city, demanding they transform the backyard of my Buckhead estate into an extravagant wonderland by the weekend. Valerie spared absolutely no expense squandering the illicit funds with reckless abandon. She ordered thousands of imported white orchids to be draped across the grand balconies. She rented crystal chandeliers to hang from the ancient oak trees in the garden. She secured a private catering team, complete with an oyster bar, a champagne tower, and a 5-tier custom cake layered with edible gold leaf. She wanted the event to look like a royal coronation. She quickly drafted expedited digital invitations and sent them to the most exclusive guest list she could compile. She invited the entire country club elite, local Atlanta politicians, prominent judges, and wealthy socialites she desperately wanted to impress. The invitation boasted about the family's expanding real estate portfolio and their boundless generational wealth. She wanted every powerful person in the city standing on the lawn of my property, believing that she was the undisputed queen of Buckhead. She was actively inviting the most influential people in Georgia to witness the exact moment her entire life would violently implode. Trey and Raven were not left out of the spending frenzy. Trey felt intensely emasculated by the fact that the demolition crew had laughed at his mother and walked out of the house. He needed to prove to Raven and her superficial social media followers that he was a powerful, wealthy man capable of providing a lavish lifestyle. He demanded his share of the extracted equity from Jamal. Trey did not use the money to invest in a business. He did not use it to secure a down payment on a house for his unborn child. Driven entirely by ego and vanity, he took the stolen cash and marched directly into a high-end luxury car dealership in Alpharetta. He wanted to make a statement that would shut down any rumors about his family being broke. He signed a catastrophic high-interest lease agreement on a brand-new top-of-the-line Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. He used the stolen federal funds to make a massive, unrecoverable down payment, ensuring the monthly rates were locked in under his own name. The presentation of the car was a masterclass in absolute delusion. Trey arranged for the dealership to deliver the gleaming black SUV directly to the circular driveway of the Buckhead estate, complete with a massive red velvet bow strapped to the hood. When the delivery truck arrived, Raven ran out the front doors screaming in pure unadulterated delight. She threw her arms around Trey, kissing him aggressively, while her phone was propped up on a tripod, broadcasting the entire spectacle live to her Instagram audience. "Look at what my amazing future husband just bought me!" Raven squealed into the camera, waving the heavy metallic key fob. "This is what real generational wealth looks like. We do not do cheap sedans in this family. We only drive the best." To all the haters and broke relatives who tried to bring us down earlier this week, keep watching from the sidelines. We are winning and you are nothing. Trey leaned against the hood of the stolen vehicle, flashing his brand new diamond earrings, crossing his arms to look as wealthy and intimidating as possible. He genuinely believed he had secured his status as a young Atlanta millionaire. He had no idea that the vehicle he was leaning against was technically property of a federal crime scene. The family spent the next 48 hours living in a state of absolute euphoric denial. They paraded around the estate, barking orders at the party planners, testing the expensive catered food, and admiring Jamal's new Rolex. They felt they had conquered the world. They firmly believed that they had outsmarted the system, defeated their hated family member, and secured their luxury lifestyle forever. They were so intoxicated by the influx of cash and the illusion of power that they failed to notice the silence coming from my end. They thought my silence was the silence of a defeated coward. They assumed I had accepted my loss and retreated into the shadows, too humiliated and broke to fight back. They were entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward them. While they were busy tasting imported caviar and polishing the hood of a fraudulently acquired Mercedes, I was sitting in the sleek boardroom of my corporate headquarters, surrounded by a team of elite corporate litigators and compliance officers. I watched the financial reports roll in, confirming that Jamal had successfully moved the stolen funds through multiple banking institutions. The paper trail was flawless, perfectly documenting every single federal violation he had committed. The local sheriff's department had already approved the emergency eviction notice based on the forged deed tampering, and the federal authorities had filed the preliminary injunctions required to freeze all associated assets. The family had spent the stolen money perfectly setting themselves up for the maximum possible criminal enhancements. Their arrogance had completely sealed their fate. As the sun set over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the extravagant party preparations in my backyard, I smiled at the glowing screens in my boardroom. The stage was set for the grandest, most devastating performance of their lives. The evening of the engagement party arrived with a suffocating blanket of southern humidity and an even thicker layer of overwhelming arrogance. The backyard of the Buckhead estate had been utterly transformed from a quiet family garden into a tasteless, ostentatious display of newly acquired wealth. String lights draped across the ancient oak trees, casting a golden theatrical hue over a 50-foot catered buffet. A live jazz quartet played near the edge of the illuminated infinity pool, while white-gloved waiters circulated through the crowd with silver trays of imported caviar and endless bottles of vintage champagne. At the absolute center of this ridiculous circus was Raven. She wore a custom beaded gown that dragged heavily across the expensive patio tiles, clutching a crystal flute of champagne in one hand and her latest smartphone in the other. She abruptly excused herself from a group of local beauty influencers and marched up the grand sweeping staircase of the mansion. She strutted straight into my former master suite, actively ignoring the exposed drywall construction dust and jagged wooden beams left behind from the halted demolition crew. She stepped out onto the Juliet balcony overlooking the lavish party below. She quickly mounted her phone on a portable ring light stand she had dragged upstairs and hit the live button on her Instagram account. Within seconds, thousands of her eager followers tuned in to watch. Raven tossed her hair, smoothed the front of her designer gown, and flashed a predatory, heavily manicured smile at the camera lens. "Welcome to the top tier, everyone!" Raven shrieked into the microphone, holding up her left hand to aggressively display her massive diamond engagement ring. "We are coming to you live from the absolute premier engagement event of the entire Atlanta season right in our very own spectacular backyard. And when I say our backyard, I mean it literally. We finally purged the toxic broke energy from this mansion. Good riddance to the jealous, bitter sister who tried to drag us all down. She simply could not handle seeing young, successful people thriving. So she threw a massive temper tantrum, packed her cheap little bags, and ran away into the night." Raven paused to take a theatrical sip of her champagne, leaning over the wrought iron balcony railing to pan the camera across the massive crowd of wealthy socialites below. "Our family only has room for winners," she gloated, her voice echoing slightly over the music. "We do not do charity cases, and we definitely do not tolerate miserable spinsters trying to ruin our vibe. Watch out, Atlanta, because the new generation of the family is officially taking over the throne tonight." She blew an exaggerated kiss to the camera, entirely unaware that her broadcast was actively documenting her illegal presence on a commercial property she was about to be federally indicted for trespassing on. Down on the perfectly manicured lawn, Valerie was delivering the performance of a lifetime. She glided through the crowd of local politicians, sitting judges, and influential country club socialites like a conquering queen. She wore an absurdly expensive emerald green evening gown purchased directly with the stolen equity from the fraudulent mortgage. She spotted a prominent Atlanta City councilman near the Oyster Bar and immediately steered him by the elbow toward Jamal. "You simply must speak with my brilliant son-in-law," Valerie boasted, her voice artificially loud to ensure every surrounding guest could hear her every word. "Jamal is an absolute financial visionary. The commercial real estate market has been so unpredictable lately, but his sheer genius just secured our family's entire property portfolio. He executed a masterful corporate restructuring just this week that practically doubled our liquid assets. We are aggressively expanding our holdings while everyone else in the city is downsizing." Jamal puffed out his chest, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored Italian suit to ensure the $40,000 stolen gold Rolex caught the flickering light of the patio tiki torches. He shook the councilman's hand with aggressive, overcompensating confidence. It is all about strategic leverage and knowing exactly how to outsmart the corporate entities trying to steal Black generational wealth. Jamal lied smoothly, a smug grin plastered across his face. I simply protected what rightfully belongs to this family and ensured we remain at the absolute top of the food chain. Just a few feet away, my sister Renee was holding court with a circle of gossiping socialites and country club wives. She had already consumed 4 large glasses of champagne, and her volume control was completely gone. "Oh, you noticed Simone is missing?" Renee laughed loudly, throwing her head back and slapping the shoulder of a wealthy doctor's wife. "Yes, well, we had to cut the dead weight out of the estate." She was so incredibly jealous of Trey and Raven getting married and building the family legacy. She threw a massive, pathetic temper tantrum and stormed out when my mother simply asked her to switch bedrooms to accommodate the new baby. She is probably sitting in a roach-infested motel right now crying over a cold microwave dinner. It is honestly pathetic how some people just refuse to elevate themselves to our level. The women around her chuckled, sipping their expensive drinks and shaking their heads in mock sympathy. The sheer magnitude of their collective delusion was staggering. They were standing directly on a federal crime scene, drinking stolen champagne, and openly celebrating a major felony, while mocking the very woman who legally owned the ground beneath their designer heels. 20 miles away, the atmosphere could not have been more drastically different. My tuxedo parka was a fortress of absolute pristine tranquility. I sat alone in my expansive home office, where the floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a breathtaking, uninterrupted view of the Atlanta skyline, lighting up against the deep purple twilight sky. The room was perfectly silent, except for the soft, ambient notes of a classical cello playing from my hidden surround sound speakers. There were no fake friends to entertain. There was no desperate need to prove my worth to strangers. I was wearing a comfortable silk lounge set, sitting barefoot in my plush leather executive chair. I held a crystal glass of a very rare, very expensive vintage Bordeaux, swirling the deep ruby red liquid slowly against the glass. On my massive curved mahogany desk sat 2 sleek high-definition monitors. The left screen displayed a live encrypted feed from the hidden security cameras I had long ago installed around the exterior of the Buckhead estate. I watched in crystal clear high definition as the hired caterers carried out massive silver trays of prime rib to the guests. I watched Raven twirl in her gown on my former balcony. I watched Valerie laugh loudly with the city councilman. I watched them gorge themselves on the stolen fruits of their own impending destruction. The right screen displayed something far more powerful than any social gathering. It was the internal administrative dashboard for the commercial lending subsidiary of my real estate conglomerate. I had the fraudulent mortgage account open, highlighted, and ready to process. I also had my encrypted corporate email client queued up with a highly sensitive message addressed directly to the Legal Compliance Division of the bank, the Fulton County Sheriff's Department Eviction Task Force, and the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Attached to the email were the verified forensic reports of Jamal's forged signature, the official wire transfer receipts, tracking the stolen $300,000 to his offshore bookies, the undisputed proof of deed fraud, and the legal property deed proving Vanguard Horizon Holdings LLC was the sole owner of the estate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue. I glanced down at the vintage Cartier watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The engagement party was hitting its absolute peak. The jazz music was loud, the guests were heavily intoxicated, and my family's arrogance had reached an all-time catastrophic high. The timing was absolutely perfect. I set my wine glass down gently on the mahogany desk. I moved my right hand to the wireless computer mouse. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation, guilt, or remorse. They had made their choices over and over again. They had bullied, manipulated, and stolen. They had looked me right in the eye and demanded I sleep in a damp basement while plotting to steal my inheritance. Now they were going to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of the United States federal justice system. I clicked the mouse. The first click triggered the irrevocable default clauses in the commercial loan agreement. Instantly, an automated banking protocol initiated across the financial network. Jamal's offshore shell accounts, the exact ones he thought were completely untraceable and secure, were forcefully frozen by international banking regulators responding to the immediate wire fraud alert. The remaining stolen funds were instantly locked. His personal and business credit cards were deactivated simultaneously. The second click sent the comprehensive legal email. The digital payload launched through the highly secure corporate servers, landing directly in the high-priority inboxes of the federal agents and local deputies who had been standing by all week for my final executive authorization. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers behind my head and turning my full, unblinking attention to the live security feed on my left monitor. The music at the Buckhead estate was still blaring through the garden speakers. The wealthy guests were still laughing and clinking their glasses. Valerie was still parading around the patio in her stolen emerald gown. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world had just been digitally vaporized. The lavish party they were currently enjoying was no longer a celebration of their fictional generational wealth. It was simply the catered waiting room for their impending federal arrests. The countdown had officially hit zero. Section 8, 500 words. The golden hour in Atlanta slowly gave way to a deep twilight, casting long, dramatic shadows across the extravagant backyard of the Buckhead estate. The suffocating summer humidity had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp evening breeze that rustled through the massive oak trees. Valerie had spared absolutely no expense for this engagement party, and it showed in every meticulously curated detail. Dozens of custom crystal chandeliers hung from the thick branches, illuminating the manicured lawn with a warm, expensive glow. The live jazz quartet played a smooth, sophisticated melody that floated over the chatter of the city's most elite socialites. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with imported caviar, Wagyu beef sliders, and endless flutes of vintage champagne. Everything was designed to project an image of untouchable generational wealth. Valerie glided across the patio in her stolen emerald gown, acting as the ultimate high society matriarch. She greeted local politicians, sitting judges, and wealthy real estate developers with a sickeningly sweet smile, masking the fact that every single item at this party was paid for with stolen federal funds. She firmly believed she had secured her place at the absolute top of the Atlanta elite hierarchy. Renee stood near the massive stone fire pit, holding court. With a circle of prominent country club wives, she laughed loudly, tossing her head back and flashing her diamond tennis bracelet. Renee reveled in the attention, openly bragging about how her husband Jamal had orchestrated a brilliant financial maneuver to secure the family legacy. She actively mocked my absence, telling anyone who would listen that I had been exiled from the family because I lacked the sophistication and business acumen required to handle real wealth. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She was standing on my property, drinking champagne bought with money stolen from my corporation, while attempting to publicly assassinate my character. Trey and Raven held court near the five-tier custom engagement cake, posing for endless photographs. Trey wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, leaning aggressively against the catered buffet table, as if he owned the entire neighborhood. Raven constantly flashed her massive diamond ring to the cameras, broadcasting her fake lavish lifestyle to her thousands of social media followers. They were entirely intoxicated by their own fabricated success, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to give way. The music softened as the lead singer of the jazz quartet stepped back from the microphone. Jamal stepped up to the small wooden stage that had been erected near the infinity pool. He adjusted his silk tie and tapped the microphone, sending a sharp feedback sound echoing across the backyard. The chatter of the wealthy guests slowly died down as they turned their attention to the front. Jamal stood tall, puffing out his chest and raising his glass of champagne high into the air. He wore a smug, predatory grin, completely drunk on the illusion of his own absolute power. He looked down at Valerie, who nodded approvingly, her eyes shining with malicious triumph. Desmond stood near the back of the crowd, clutching a glass of scotch, looking like a hollow shell of a man, but forcing a proud smile for the sake of his wealthy peers. Jamal cleared his throat, ensuring that every single influential guest in the backyard was hanging on his every word. He was ready to deliver a speech that would cement his false reputation as a financial genius. Friends, family, and esteemed guests. Jamal began, his voice booming over the speakers with artificial authority. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the union of Trey and Raven. But more importantly, we are here to celebrate the enduring strength and absolute financial dominance of our family legacy. We have faced challenges recently. We have had to make difficult decisions to cut away the dead weight that threatened to hold this family back. He paused, looking directly at a group of local real estate developers, making sure his veiled insult toward me landed perfectly. But through strategic leverage, aggressive corporate acquisitions, and unwavering loyalty, we have secured our empire. We are not just surviving in this city, we are conquering it. This estate, this beautiful home you see around you, is a testament to our relentless drive and our absolute refusal to let anyone take what rightfully belongs to us. We have outsmarted the system. We have secured our generational wealth. So please raise your glasses with me to Trey and Raven and to the unstoppable future of this family. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Glasses clinked together, sending a chorus of high-pitched chimes ringing through the warm evening air. Valerie wiped a fake tear from her eye, beaming with pride. Raven squealed and threw her arms around Trey, kissing him deeply for the cameras. Jamal took a long, triumphant sip of his champagne, basking in the adoration of the Atlanta elite. He felt completely untouchable. He believed he had successfully stolen $300,000, committed federal wire fraud, forged legal documents, and entirely gotten away with it. He believed he was the smartest man in the entire state of Georgia. Suddenly, a violent crashing sound completely shattered the sophisticated atmosphere. The heavy wrought iron security gates at the front of the estate, designed to keep unwanted visitors out, were aggressively and forcefully pushed open. The grinding screech of metal against metal echoed loudly over the sprawling property. The polite applause in the backyard stopped instantly. The jazz quartet froze mid-note, their instruments hanging awkwardly in the air. The wealthy guests turned their heads in mass confusion, looking toward the long, winding driveway. A low, menacing rumble of heavy engines grew louder by the second. Tires crunched violently against the pristine gravel, but the vehicles did not stop at the designated valet parking area. They did not respect the boundaries of Valerie's meticulously curated event. Three heavy-duty Fulton County Sheriff vehicles drove directly onto the manicured front lawn, crushing the expensive imported orchids and tearing deep, muddy trenches into the pristine grass. The police cruisers formed a tactical perimeter, their bright blue and red emergency lights flashing silently but aggressively illuminating the shocked faces of the high society guests. Immediately following the sheriff cruisers, two massive, unmarked, heavily tinted black SUVs rolled onto the property. These vehicles belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sheer physical presence of the law enforcement vehicles completely suffocated the party. The atmosphere shifted from arrogant celebration to absolute paralyzing terror in a matter of seconds. The flashing police lights cast harsh, erratic shadows against the red brick walls of the mansion, making the entire estate look like an active crime scene. The doors of the black SUVs swung open in perfect unison. Six highly trained federal agents stepped out onto the crushed grass, wearing dark tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow text across their chests. They moved with terrifying efficiency, their hands resting casually but firmly near their duty belts. Accompanying them were four uniformed Fulton County Sheriff deputies, who immediately fanned out to secure the perimeter of the backyard, blocking all potential exits. The silence in the backyard was absolute. The local politicians, sitting judges, and prominent business leaders who had been happily drinking stolen champagne just moments before instantly recognized the severe gravity of a federal raid. They immediately began stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from Valerie, Jamal, and the rest of the family. The elite socialites lowered their glasses, their faces pale with shock and sudden profound embarrassment. Jamal stood frozen on the wooden stage, the microphone slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the wooden floorboards with a loud, piercing thud. The smug, predatory grin had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who suddenly realized he was going to prison. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly felt like a heavy iron shackle dragging his arm down. Valerie stood completely paralyzed near the oyster bar, her chest heaving as she tried to process the catastrophic scene unfolding in her backyard. Trey pulled Raven behind him, his false bravado completely shattered. Desmond dropped his glass of scotch, hiding his face in his hands, as the reality of his cowardice finally caught up with him. The illusion of their generational wealth was violently disintegrating right before their eyes. Behind the impenetrable blockade of flashing police cruisers and federal vehicles, a sleek custom black luxury town car glided smoothly up the driveway. The driver, a tall, imposing man in a dark suit, stepped out and swiftly opened the rear passenger door. I stepped out of the vehicle into the flashing blue and red lights. I was dressed impeccably in a razor-sharp tailored white designer suit that stood out brilliantly against the dark, chaotic backdrop of the raid. I wore black stilettos and carried a sleek leather briefcase exuding absolute power, control, and unbothered calm. I was not the terrified, weak scapegoat they had bullied and mocked just days prior. I was the executioner. Flanking me on either side were two elite corporate litigators from my real estate conglomerate, both holding thick files containing the irrefutable forensic evidence of Jamal federal crimes. I walked slowly and deliberately up the flagstone path toward the backyard. The federal agents and sheriff deputies respectfully parted to let me through, recognizing my status as the legal owner of the property and the cooperating victim of the fraud. The dynamic in the backyard shifted with an almost physical force as I stepped onto the patio. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, allowing me a clear, unobstructed path directly to my family. Valerie stared at me, her eyes wide with absolute sheer horror. She looked at my pristine white suit, my calm expression, and the federal agent standing at my command. The reality of her total defeat hit her with the force of a speeding train. Her grip completely failed. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers, falling in slow motion before shattering violently against the stone patio tiles. The sharp sound of the breaking glass echoed loudly in the silent, tense air, officially signaling the absolute end of her high society reign. The sharp sound of the breaking glass echoing across the stone patio was the exact moment Valerie realized her entire fabricated universe was collapsing. But instead of retreating, her deeply ingrained narcissism and desperate need for social preservation kicked into overdrive. She could not simply surrender in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. Her brain short-circuited the reality of the federal agents standing on the lawn and defaulted to the only defense mechanism she knew, which was loud, aggressive entitlement. Valerie stepped forward, the heels of her stolen emerald gown crunching loudly over the shattered remains of her champagne flute. She squared her shoulders, forcing a manic, terrifyingly fake smile onto her face as she looked around at the silent, horrified crowd of socialites and politicians. She clapped her hands together, a sharp, hollow sound that completely failed to cut the immense tension in the air. "This is just a misunderstanding," Valerie announced, her voice pitching up in a frantic, desperate vibrato. "A simple clerical error with the event permits, I am sure of it. Please everyone continue enjoying the music and the caviar. We will have this sorted out in a moment." She then turned her venomous gaze directly toward me. The fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She marched across the patio, closing the distance between us with aggressive, heavy steps. She stopped just a few feet away, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "How dare you show your face here," Valerie hissed, keeping her voice low but entirely laced with poison. "You pathetic, jealous little girl. You actually called the police to crash your own brother's engagement party. Just because you are bitter and alone, you are completely unhinged." She did not wait for my response. Valerie whipped her head around and began screaming toward the heavy iron gates where she had hired a private security detail for the evening. "Guards!" she yelled, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Get over here right now. This woman is trespassing on private property. I want her physically removed from my estate immediately. Drag her out to the street if you have to. She is ruining a highly exclusive event." The hired private security guards stood completely frozen near the catering tents. They were large, intimidating men, but they were not fools. They took one look at the heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and the Fulton County Sheriff deputies surrounding the perimeter, and they absolutely refused to move a single muscle. They immediately crossed their arms and stepped backward, universally deciding that no hourly wage was worth interfering with a massive federal raid. Valerie's face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. Her command had been entirely ignored, broadcast live to the very people she was trying to impress. She opened her mouth to scream at the guards again, but she never got the chance. The elite corporate attorney standing to my right stepped forward smoothly. He moved with the calculated, unbothered precision of a man who destroyed fraudulent empires for a living. He did not yell, he did not flinch, and he did not show a single ounce of intimidation. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a bright, unmistakable neon yellow legal document. It was folded neatly, but the stark color screamed of immediate, non-negotiable legal action. Without saying a word, the attorney extended his arm and slapped the bright yellow document directly against Valerie's chest. The motion was so swift and definitive that Valerie instinctively brought her hands up to catch the paper before it fell to the patio floor. "What is this garbage?" Valerie spat, holding the document by the very corner, as if it were a contagious disease. She refused to look down at the bold black text printed across the top of the page. She tried to shove the paper back toward my attorney, but he simply took a deliberate step backward, placing his hands firmly behind his back, refusing to accept the return of the served legal notice. I took a slow, measured step forward. I locked eyes with Valerie, watching the sheer panic finally begin to bleed through her aggressive facade. I did not whisper. I did not keep my voice low. I raised my chin and projected my voice with crystal clear, undeniable authority, ensuring that every single judge, politician, real estate developer, and high society wife in the backyard heard every single syllable of my declaration. "This is an emergency eviction notice," I announced loudly, my voice ringing out over the silent, shocked crowd. Valerie gasped, her breath hitching violently in her throat. The wealthy guests behind her began to murmur, the hushed whispers rippling through the backyard like a sudden gust of wind. "You have illegally authorized destructive demolition on my commercial property." I continued, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with my terrified stepmother. "You have defaulted on a highly fraudulent commercial mortgage. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your belongings and vacate the premises before the sheriff boards up the doors and changes every lock on this estate." The words struck the crowd with the force of a physical explosion. The local politicians and elite socialites who had just spent the last 2 hours listening to Valerie and Jamal brag about their vast generational wealth were suddenly confronted with the brutal, humiliating truth. The family hosting this lavish, over-the-top party were not wealthy elite titans of industry. They were broke, desperate squatters who were actively being thrown out onto the street. Valerie looked down at the yellow document, her eyes frantically scanning the bold legal text. The words "Fulton County Sheriff" and "Order of Eviction" stared back at her, stamped with the official, undeniable seal of the local court. Her hands began to shake so violently that the thick paper rattled audibly in the quiet night air. "You cannot do this!" Valerie choked out, tears of sheer humiliation finally welling in her eyes. "Not tonight. Not in front of my friends. We have guests. We have the city councilman here." "You do not have friends, Valerie," I replied, my tone ice cold and surgically precise. "You have hostages to your delusion. And as of right now, this party is officially over." The sheer magnitude of the public embarrassment was too much for the golden child to handle. Trey, who had been hiding behind the engagement cake with Raven, suddenly snapped. The fragile, fabricated masculine ego he had spent the entire evening inflating was completely obliterated. He realized that his wealthy friends, his fiancée, and his entire social circle were watching him get legally tossed out of a house he did not own. The humiliation mutated instantly into blinding, uncontrollable rage. "Shut up!" Trey screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he stormed out from behind the dessert tables. He shoved past a group of terrified country club wives, his face twisted in a mask of furious, unearned entitlement. "You do not own us. This is my house. This is my legacy. You are just a bitter, lonely failure trying to ruin my life." Trey did not stop marching. Blinded by rage and completely ignoring the heavy law enforcement presence surrounding the patio, he balled his hands into tight fists and lunged directly toward me. He fully intended to physically attack me right in front of the federal agents, entirely convinced that his status as the golden child would somehow protect him from the consequences of assaulting a woman. I did not even make it within 5 feet of me. The response from the Fulton County Sheriff deputies was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely uncompromising. Before Trey could even raise his arm, two massive, heavily armored deputies intercepted his path with terrifying speed. One deputy grabbed Trey by the shoulder of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket, while the other deputy swept his legs entirely out from under him. Trey let out a loud, pathetic yelp as he went airborne. The deputies drove him face first into the nearest catered buffet table. The impact was spectacular. The heavy wooden table groaned under the sudden weight. Massive silver platters of imported Wagyu beef sliders, expensive shrimp cocktails, and towers of artisanal cheeses went flying into the air, crashing violently onto the stone patio. Trey's face was shoved directly into a spilled tray of caviar, his expensive tuxedo instantly ruined by grease and crushed hors d'oeuvres. "Get your hands behind your back!" one of the deputies roared, pressing his knee forcefully into the small of Trey's back, completely pinning the golden child against the ruined buffet. "Stop resisting or you will be tased." Trey thrashed wildly against the table, completely panicked, screaming obscenities and demanding that someone call his lawyer. He looked absolutely ridiculous, a spoiled, entitled child throwing a physical tantrum while being restrained by actual law enforcement. Raven let out a piercing theatrical shriek of sheer horror. She covered her mouth with both hands, staring at her fiancé, who was currently being treated like a common street criminal. The carefully curated, highly filtered fairy tale she had been broadcasting to her followers had just evolved into a violent, chaotic nightmare. The elite high society guests did not rush forward to help Trey. They did not shout at the police to stop. They did exactly what status-obsessed socialites always do when faced with a catastrophic public scandal. They pulled out their smartphones. All across the backyard, the glowing screens of dozens of iPhones illuminated the darkness. Wealthy doctors, prominent lawyers, and country club influencers were actively recording every single second of the meltdown. The flashing blue and red emergency lights from the police cruisers reflected off the camera lenses, capturing Trey being handcuffed against a buffet table, and Valerie standing in the center of the patio holding a neon yellow eviction notice while crying uncontrollably. Valerie looked around at the sea of recording phones, her worst absolute nightmare materializing in vivid high-definition reality. The elite image she had spent decades meticulously crafting, the false narrative of immense wealth and power she had used to belittle and abuse me, was shattering into a million irreparable pieces in real time. She tried to raise her hands to cover her face, but she could not hide from the lenses. The entire city of Atlanta was going to wake up the next morning to viral videos of the great Valerie being legally thrown onto the street. The whispers of the crowd grew louder, cutting through the humid night air like sharpened knives. "Did she really say eviction?" one woman whispered loudly, leaning into her husband. "They do not even own the house," a prominent judge muttered, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "They used us for a photo op. This whole family is completely fraudulent." I stood perfectly still, watching the chaotic symphony of their destruction play out exactly as I had orchestrated. My white suit remained completely unblemished, a stark contrast to the mud-spilled food and shattered glass covering my family. The first devastating blow had landed with absolute perfection, but the night was far from over. I looked past the restrained, sobbing figure of my brother, turning my gaze directly toward the weeping, hysterical figure of his fiancée. It was time to show Raven exactly what happens when you brag about driving a vehicle funded by a federal crime. Raven could no longer handle the suffocating atmosphere of the ruined backyard. The flashing camera flashes from the smartphones of Atlanta elite felt like physical strikes against her carefully constructed image. Her perfect engagement party had devolved into a law enforcement spectacle, and her golden child fiancé was currently face down in a platter of ruined caviar, with his hands cuffed behind his back. The public humiliation was absolute. She needed an escape. She needed to flee the premises before any of the socialite influencers she had desperately tried to impress could ask her a single question. She gathered the heavy beaded fabric of her custom designer gown, hoisting it up to her knees, and began to run. Her expensive high heels clicked frantically against the stone patio as she shoved past a group of stunned local politicians. She was heading straight for the circular driveway at the front of the estate. Sitting there, bathed in the glow of the landscape lighting, was her ultimate pride and joy. the brand new black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. It was the vehicle Trey had presented to her just days ago, with a massive red velvet bow. It was the car she had bragged about to thousands of followers on her Instagram livestream, claiming it was a symbol of their immense generational wealth. She pulled the heavy metallic key fob from her designer clutch, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it onto the pristine gravel. She pressed the unlock button desperately. The luxury SUV chirped happily, its headlights flashing in the dark. Raven let out a ragged, breathless sob of relief. If she could just get inside the vehicle, lock the heavy doors, and drive away, she could escape the nightmarish reality unfolding on the lawn. She could retreat to a luxury hotel and pretend none of this was happening. She grabbed the chrome handle of the driver's side door and pulled it open, ready to climb into the plush leather interior. A deafening blast from a heavy industrial air horn shattered the night air. Raven froze half inside the vehicle. The ground beneath her designer heels began to vibrate. A massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck, painted in stark industrial yellow and covered in reflective safety tape, was reversing aggressively up the long, winding driveway of the Buckhead estate. Its bright amber warning lights rotated furiously, casting harsh, sweeping shadows across the manicured lawn and the terrified faces of the remaining guests who had followed Raven to the front yard to witness the unfolding drama. The loud, rhythmic beeping of the truck backup alarm drowned out the smooth jazz music that was still faintly playing from the backyard. The tow truck driver, a burly man wearing a high-visibility safety vest and a faded baseball cap, did not slow down. He expertly maneuvered the massive rig, positioning the rear hydraulic lift directly in front of the gleaming black Mercedes-Benz. The air brakes engaged with a loud, aggressive hiss. "What are you doing?" Raven shrieked, dropping the fabric of her gown and running toward the tow truck. "Get away from my car. My fiancé just bought this for me. You are on private property. I will call the police." The tow truck driver hopped down from the cab, completely unbothered by her screaming. He carried a heavy metal clipboard and a set of thick steel chains. He did not even look at Raven. He simply walked past her, unspooling the thick steel cables from the back of his rig. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," the driver said, his voice flat and bored. He had clearly dealt with screaming, entitled socialites before. "I have a legal repossession order from the primary lion holder. This vehicle is being seized as evidence in an active federal investigation." "Evidence?" Raven screamed, her voice cracking in pure hysterical panic. She looked around wildly, seeking help from the crowd of wealthy guests who had gathered on the front steps of the mansion. No one moved. The elite country club wives and prominent judges simply stood there, holding their phones high, recording every humiliating second of the repossession. "What investigation? This is a brand new car. We paid the down payment in cash. You did not pay for anything, Raven." My voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. I walked slowly up the gravel driveway, flanked by my two corporate attorneys. The flashing amber lights of the tow truck reflected off my pristine white suit. I did not rush. I moved with the deliberate, terrifying calm of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Raven, holding a thick stack of printed financial documents in my left hand. Raven whipped her head around to face me, her eyes wide with frantic terror. "Simone," she gasped, taking a step backward until her back hit the driver's side door of the luxury SUV. "Tell him to stop. Tell him he has the wrong house. Trey bought this car for me. It is mine." I raised my hand, extending the stack of documents directly toward her chest. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with enough carrying power to ensure the entire crowd of recording socialites heard every single damning word. "That car was leased using $300,000 stolen directly from the equity of my commercial property." I announced, the truth hitting the night air like a physical blow. "Trey did not buy you anything, Raven. Jamal forged my signature on a legal document, committed federal wire fraud, and handed your fiancé the stolen cash to pay for this ridiculous lease." Raven stared at the documents I was holding but refused to take them. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute magnitude of the crime was finally penetrating her superficial reality. "The dealership has been fully notified of the wire fraud." I continued, my tone devoid of any mercy. "The federal agents currently raiding the backyard have flagged the transaction. The vehicle you have been bragging about to your thousands of followers is not a symbol of your fake generational wealth. It is the direct product of a massive federal crime. It is being repossessed right now and impounded as primary material evidence. No, Raven wailed, her voice deteriorating into a pathetic, broken sob. She turned back to the tow truck driver, who had already hooked the thick steel chains underneath the front axle of the heavy luxury vehicle. Please, you cannot take it. All my friends are watching. Please, I need this car. The tow truck driver ignored her pathetic pleas. He pulled a heavy metal lever on the side of his rig. The powerful hydraulic lift whined loudly, engaging its gears. The front wheels of the gleaming black Mercedes-Benz lifted slowly and violently off the pristine gravel. The suspension groaned under the immense pressure. Trey Raven screamed at the top of her lungs, turning her tear-streaked face toward the backyard. Trey, do something. Tell them to stop. Right on cue. The two Fulton County Sheriff deputies marched Trey around the side of the mansion. His hands were securely cuffed behind his back. His custom-tailored tuxedo was completely ruined, covered in dark mud, crushed cheese, and the greasy remnants of the catered buffet. His face was bruised from being slammed into the catering table, and his previously arrogant demeanor had completely vanished. He looked absolutely pathetic. Trey was forced to stand there, flanked by armed law enforcement, and watch as the ultimate symbol of his fake masculinity was literally dragged away. He could not protect his fiancée. He could not protect his own ego. He had promised Raven a life of elite luxury and infinite wealth. Now he was standing in handcuffs, covered in garbage, watching a repo man haul away a vehicle funded by a felony. The emasculation was total and absolute. He dropped his head, staring down at the gravel, unable to look Raven in the eye. He was completely stripped of his golden child armor, exposed to the world as nothing more than a fraudulent, desperate criminal. Raven fell to her knees on the sharp gravel, completely ignoring the damage to her custom-beaded gown. She clutched her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as the tow truck driver secured the final safety straps. The loud clanking of the metal chains provided a brutal, unforgiving soundtrack to her complete social destruction. The luxury SUV was securely mounted onto the back of the rig. The driver climbed back into the cab, released the air brakes, and shifted into gear. The heavy truck lurched forward, pulling the massive black Mercedes down the long, winding driveway and out through the heavy iron gates. The bright red taillights disappeared into the dark Atlanta night, taking Raven's entire fabricated identity along with it. I stood over her weeping figure, looking down at the ruined woman who just hours prior had stood on my balcony and called me a jealous, bitter failure. The crowd of wealthy guests on the front steps remained completely silent, their smartphones still recording the devastating aftermath. They had come to this estate expecting to rub elbows with the next generation of Atlanta elite. Instead, they had received front-row tickets to the most spectacular financial and social implosion in the history of Buckhead. I turned away from Raven, leaving her crying in the dirt. I had one final score to settle. Trey and Raven had been dealt with, but the true architects of this entire fraudulent disaster still needed to face their reckoning. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, signaled for my corporate attorneys to follow, and walked calmly back toward the chaotic scene in the backyard. It was time to deal with the mastermind, who thought he could forge his way into my empire, and the sister who had cheered him on every step of the way. I strode back towards the glowing chaos of the backyard, my heels clicking methodically against the stone pathway. The ambient noise of the party had entirely morphed into a low, frantic hum of wealthy guests gossiping and recording. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers bathed the remaining caterers and the ruined buffet in a harsh, unforgiving glow. I scanned the chaotic patio, my eyes cutting through the sea of panicked socialites, until I found my target, Jamal. Jamal was not an idiot despite his gross legal incompetence. The moment he saw the letters FBI emblazoned across the tactical vests of the federal agents, the fragile house of cards he had built inside his mind completely disintegrated. The delusion of being a financial genius evaporated, replaced by the primal, suffocating terror of a cornered animal. I knew exactly why the feds were crashing a residential engagement party. He could feel the $40,000 stolen Rolex burning like a branding iron against his wrist. He was sweating profusely. Thick, heavy drops of perspiration rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes and soaking into the starched collar of his tailored Italian suit. His eyes darted wildly around the enclosed backyard, frantically searching for an exit that did not involve walking past heavily armed federal law enforcement. He began to slowly back away from the center of the patio. He abandoned his desperate attempts to network with the city councilman, who was currently backing away from him as if he carried a lethal virus. Jamal kept his head down, trying to use the chaotic milling crowd of terrified guests as a human shield. He slipped behind the massive five-tier engagement cake and skirted the edge of the illuminated infinity pool. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He just needed to reach the heavy wrought iron back gate. Beyond that gate lay a thick wooded area that separated the Buckhead estate from the neighboring subdivision. If he could just make it to the tree line, he foolishly believed he could disappear into the Atlanta night and figure out a way to flee the state before the indictments were officially unsealed. He reached out his trembling hand to grasp the cool metal latch of the back gate. He pushed it open, a surge of desperate hope flooding his chest. But federal agents do not leave blind spots when executing a high-profile raid. As Jamal stepped through the iron threshold, a blindingly bright tactical flashlight clicked on, striking him directly in the eyes. Two massive, unsmiling FBI agents stepped out from the deep shadows of the oak trees, completely blocking his path to freedom. Jamal let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. Panic took over completely, and he made the worst possible decision a suspect can make during a federal raid. He tried to turn and run. The agents moved with terrifying practice synchronization. Before Jamal could even pivot his expensive leather shoes on the damp grass, the lead agent lunged forward. He grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his tailored suit jacket and hoisted him violently backward. The agent drove Jamal back onto the patio, using his massive forward momentum to slam the fraudulent broker directly into a heavy wooden catering station that had miraculously survived Trey's earlier takedown. The physical impact was brutal and absolute. A towering pyramid of expensive champagne flutes shattered, instantly raining sharp crystal shards down around Jamal's head. Trays of imported cheeses, delicate pastries, and heavy silver serving platters crashed to the stone patio with a deafening clatter. Jamal gasped for air as the oxygen was forcefully driven from his lungs. The second agent grabbed Jamal's right arm, twisting it sharply and painfully behind his back. The distinct, terrifying metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly over the murmuring crowd. The sound finalized the absolute end of Jamal's fraudulent existence. How was pressed face down against the sticky champagne-soaked tablecloth, groaning in sheer physical pain and absolute public humiliation. Renee, who had been hiding near the outdoor bar, let out a blood-curdling scream that tore through the humid night air. She dropped her designer clutch and sprinted toward the ruined catering table, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated horror. Jamal, she shrieked violently, pushing past a terrified local politician who was trying to flee the yard. "What are you doing to my husband? Get your hands off him right now. He is a highly respected financial broker. You are making a massive mistake." I stepped smoothly through the parted crowd, arriving at the ruined catering station, just as the federal agent hauled Jamal up to a humiliating kneeling position. Jamal's custom-tailored suit was entirely ruined, soaked in expensive vintage champagne and covered in crushed hors d'oeuvres. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and pleading desperation. Renee rushed to his side, grabbing his shoulder, her hands trembling violently. She looked up at me, her eyes darting frantically between my pristine white suit and the armed federal agents currently holding her husband captive. "Simone, tell them to stop!" Renee begged, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her sudden horrifying reality. "This is a massive misunderstanding. Jamal has not done anything wrong. Tell them they have the wrong person. Please, you have to fix this." I looked down at my older sister, the woman who had spent my entire life belittling me, mocking my career, and treating me like an insignificant peasant who was unworthy to share her oxygen. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a lethal, absolute clarity that commanded the undivided attention of every single person remaining in the backyard. "I am afraid I cannot do that. Renee." I stated my tone entirely, devoid of a single ounce of pity or sisterly affection. "Your husband is exactly where he belongs." Jamal stared at me, his chest heaving violently as he struggled to catch his breath. You set me up, he hissed, spitting a mouthful of champagne and dirt onto the patio stones. You knew the whole time. You planned this. Of course I knew, Jamal, I replied, taking a deliberate step closer, forcing him to look up at the woman he firmly thought he had so easily outsmarted. You thought you found a brilliant legal loophole in my corporation. You thought I was too scared and intimidated to fight back against your pathetic threats. But you are not a financial genius, Jamal. You are a desperate, sloppy amateur with a massive underground gambling addiction, and you just willingly handed me the exact forensic evidence I needed to bury you forever. I turned my intense gaze back to Renee, making absolutely sure she understood the exact magnitude of the destruction her husband had intentionally brought upon their entire lives. Forging my signature on a legal power of attorney document to extract $300,000 from a commercial lender is a severe federal offense. I announced, my words ringing out like gunshots over the quiet, captivated crowd. Using a fraudulent deed to secure a cash-out mortgage is felony deed fraud. And routing those stolen funds through an electronic banking system across state lines to pay off your offshore bookies elevates the entire scheme to massive, undeniable wire fraud. Renee gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer shock. She stumbled backward, the catastrophic reality of the charges hitting her with the blunt force of a physical blow. You committed these severe financial crimes against a private lending firm that happens to be a direct subsidiary of my own commercial real estate conglomerate. I continued, leaning down slightly to speak directly into Jamal's terrified face. I personally received your flagged application on my desk. I personally authorized the disbursement of those funds into your account. I gave you the rope, Jamal, and you gleefully tied the noose around your own neck. Enjoy your 15-year vacation in federal prison. The crushing weight of those words. The absolute, inescapable finality of a 15-year federal sentence instantly crushed whatever fight was left inside Jamal. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and he hung his head in total absolute defeat, sobbing quietly into the ruined tablecloth. The grand illusion of his high society life was permanently and publicly destroyed. Renee could not process the devastation unfolding before her eyes. The lavish, wealthy lifestyle she had violently guarded, the elite status she had used to mock my very existence, had all been funded by a criminal enterprise that was now entirely dismantled. Her knees physically buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard, damp stone patio, falling to her knees right beside the shattered crystal and spilled champagne. She let out a loud, agonizing wail, sobbing uncontrollably into her trembling hands. The wealthy socialite she had been arrogantly bragging to just minutes ago were now actively filming her spectacular downfall, shaking their heads in profound disgust. But the most profound, agonizing collapse of the evening did not belong to Jamal or Renee. It belonged to my biological father. Desmond stood near the edge of the stone patio, utterly frozen in a state of absolute horrifying realization. For years he had buried his head in the sand. He had cowered behind his wife, allowing Valerie to bully me, allowing his new family to treat me like human garbage, all to maintain the fake, fragile piece of a household he did not even financially own. He had silently enabled their relentless greed, their toxic arrogance, and their sheer stupidity. Now, as he watched his golden child son dragged away in handcuffs, his son-in-law arrested by federal agents, his eldest daughter sobbing hysterically on the ground, and his wife publicly humiliated, the sheer magnitude of his own complicity finally crashed down upon him. He had watched me, the loyal daughter who had secretly saved him from absolute homelessness, be abused and discarded by the very people who were actively destroying his legacy. He had done absolutely nothing to stop it. The intense, overwhelming shame hit Desmond like a massive physical heart attack. He gasped sharply for air, his face turning a sickly pale shade of gray. He dropped his heavy crystal glass, the expensive scotch spilling violently over his polished leather shoes. He clutched his chest with both trembling hands, his knees shaking uncontrollably as he leaned heavily against a brick pillar for support. He looked up, his tear-filled eyes seeking mine across the chaotic, flashing lights of the ruined patio. He was silently begging for forgiveness, desperately pleading for me to fix the catastrophic disaster his lifelong cowardice had actively enabled. I met his pathetic gaze with an expression of cold, unwavering indifference. I did not move a single inch to help him. I did not offer a single word of comfort. The time for rescuing my father had long passed. Desmond quickly looked away, completely unable to bear the intense weight of my successful, unbothered gaze. He slid slowly down the rough brick pillar, crumpling into a pathetic, defeated heap on the ground, entirely broken by his own profound, inescapable shame. The mass exodus of the Atlanta elite was not a slow or graceful departure. It was a stampede of pure, ruthless self-preservation. The local politicians, the prominent judges, and the wealthy real estate developers who had been cheerfully eating catered caviar just moments ago suddenly moved with terrified urgency. They did not say their goodbyes. They did not offer a single word of sympathy or support to my completely destroyed family. They practically sprinted across the manicured lawn, making a desperate, chaotic dash for their expensive vehicles parked along the street. The city councilman, who had been laughing with Valerie earlier, nearly tripped over a broken champagne flute in his haste to escape the flashing red and blue lights. The elite country club wives frantically deleted the Instagram stories they had posted just minutes prior, actively scrubbing any digital evidence that they had ever attended this fraudulent disaster. They scrambled into their luxury sedans and sped off into the night, leaving the Buckhead estate looking like a deserted battlefield. Valerie stood frozen in the center of the ruined patio, watching her entire social circle completely evaporate. She reached her hand out weakly toward a fleeing socialite, but the woman sharply turned her head and quickened her pace, refusing to even acknowledge Valerie's existence. The devastating reality of her absolute social death finally sank in. She was toxic. She was a pariah. She was officially the most disgraced woman in the entire state of Georgia. The harsh voice of the lead Fulton County Sheriff deputy sliced through the humid night air. "Listen up," the deputy barked, hooking his thumbs into his heavy-duty utility belt. "The federal agents have secured their suspect, and the property has been officially transferred back to the legal owner. You have exactly 60 minutes to gather your essential personal belongings and vacate these premises. If you are still standing on this property when my timer goes off, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." The deputy turned and signaled to a junior officer, who marched forward carrying a large cardboard box. He dropped the box onto the stone patio right next to the ruined catered buffet. The box was filled with heavy-duty black contractor trash bags. "Grab a bag and start moving." The deputy ordered, his tone entirely devoid of pity. "Your 60 minutes started 1 minute ago." Valerie stared at the shiny black plastic garbage bags with a look of profound physical revulsion. She had spent the last decade meticulously organizing her imported designer gowns, her expensive silk scarves, and her custom Italian leather shoes in a sprawling climate-controlled walk-in closet. Now she was being ordered by armed law enforcement to stuff her entire fabricated life into cheap disposable garbage bags. She let out a pathetic whimpering sob, but the deputies simply crossed their arms and stared her down. The next hour was a symphony of absolute unfiltered humiliation. Trey had been released from his handcuffs after the federal agents confirmed he was not the primary architect of the wire fraud, but his golden child arrogance was permanently shattered. His face was still covered in dried mud and crushed caviar. He limped up the grand staircase looking like a defeated, bruised child. Raven followed closely behind him, her custom beaded gown dragging heavily across the hardwood floors. She was weeping hysterically, her makeup completely ruined, as she frantically stuffed her expensive cosmetics and designer purses into the dark plastic bags. She kept cursing Trey under her breath, blaming him for the absolute destruction of her fairy tale life. Valerie ran through the master suite, moving with frantic, manic energy. She tried to carefully fold her expensive dresses, but the deputies walking the hallways repeatedly shouted time warnings, forcing her to aggressively shove the delicate fabrics into the plastic bags. Her perfect blowout was ruined. Her face was streaked with mascara, and she was sweating profusely under the heavy gaze of the law. Desmond moved through his study like a hollow, zombified shell. He packed a few changes of clothes and a single photograph of his deceased parents. He left his expensive golf clubs and his crystal Scotch decanters behind, finally realizing that none of those status symbols had ever truly belonged to him. I stood on the front porch, flanked by my corporate attorneys, watching the pathetic procession exit the grand front doors. Valerie, Desmond, Trey, and Raven dragged the heavy black garbage bags across the pristine marble foyer, leaving trails of dirt and despair in their wake. They looked like refugees fleeing a war zone of their own making. They dragged their garbage bags down the long, winding driveway. Their heads hung low in absolute shame. They had no luxury cars waiting for them. They had to call a cheap local taxi service to haul their miserable belongings away into the dark Atlanta night. The moment their taxi disappeared down the street, a rapid construction crew I had pre-authorized pulled into the driveway. The heavy thud of wooden planks and the loud whining pitch of power drills filled the night air. Within the hour, 4 thick sheets of heavy plywood were drilled securely over the massive front doors and the lower floor windows. Heavy steel padlocks were chained around the wrought iron front gates. The Buckhead estate was completely locked down, transformed into an impenetrable fortress that my family would never step foot inside again. The immediate legal fallout over the next few weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely unforgiving. Jamal was ordered directly to a federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta. During his preliminary arraignment hearing, his slick defense attorney requested standard bail citing Jamal's status as a local business owner. The federal magistrate, however, had thoroughly reviewed the comprehensive forensic dossier my legal team provided. The judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. The judge noted that Jamal had successfully routed stolen federal funds into offshore shell accounts, making him a severe and undeniable flight risk. The gavel slammed down with a resounding crack. Bail was completely denied. Jamal was remanded to federal custody, forced to trade his tailored Italian suits for a harsh orange jumpsuit. He sat in a cold concrete cell entirely isolated from the luxury world he had tried to illegally conquer, facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 brutal years. The catastrophic ripple effect hit my sister Renee with terrifying speed. Without Jamal's fraudulent income to sustain their lavish lifestyle, her entire financial reality imploded in a matter of days. The federal authorities seized all of their joint bank accounts as part of the criminal investigation, leaving Renee absolutely penniless. Her luxury gym memberships were canceled, her credit cards were aggressively declined at the grocery store, and her leased luxury vehicle was repossessed from her driveway. Desperate to avoid being federally indicted as a co-conspirator in her husband's massive financial crimes, Renee ruthlessly threw Jamal completely under the bus. She hired a cheap strip mall attorney and immediately filed for a highly publicized divorce, citing irrecoverable financial betrayal. She was forced to declare total Chapter 7 bankruptcy, entirely liquidating what little personal assets she had left just to pay her basic legal fees. Trey and Raven, toxic relationship, suffered a similarly violent and incredibly public execution. Without the stolen money, the fake designer lifestyle, and the stolen Mercedes-Benz, their entire romance evaporated instantly. Raven was not the type of woman to stand by a broke, disgraced man with a ruined reputation. She packed her garbage bags and moved into a cheap motel room, completely furious that her path to generational wealth had been a massive lie. She turned her smartphone camera back on and went live on Instagram, but this time she was not bragging about her elite status. She launched into a vicious screaming rant, completely destroying Trey to her thousands of followers. She exposed his lack of income, his desperate need for his mother approval, and his pathetic collapse during the federal raid. She marched into a shady local pawn shop while still broadcasting live and sold the diamond engagement ring Trey had given her for a fraction of its perceived value, using the meager cash to buy a one-way bus ticket back to her hometown. Trey was left completely isolated, stripped of his golden child armor, and publicly emasculated on the internet for the entire city to see. But the most profound and devastating fall from grace belonged to Valerie and Desmond. With zero equity, zero savings, and their credit scores completely annihilated by the foreclosure they had hidden for years, they had absolutely nowhere to turn. No one in their former elite social circle would answer their phone calls. The wealthy friends they had spent decades trying to impress treated them like absolute lepers. They were aggressively and formally blacklisted from every single country club, private dining room, and elite charity organization in the greater Atlanta area. They were violently forced out of the lush green sanctuaries of Buckhead and relocated to a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a dangerous, forgotten outskirt of the city. The contrast was a brutal, unrelenting punishment. Instead of automated blackout blinds and infinity pools, they woke up to peeling yellow wallpaper, stained carpets, and the deafening roar of highway traffic vibrating through their thin single-pane windows. The air in their new neighborhood always smelled of cheap exhaust and stale garbage. Valerie was forced to take a humiliating minimum wage job working the cash register at a local discount retail store just to afford basic groceries. Every time a customer walked in who resembled one of her former country club peers, Valerie would turn her face away, her cheeks burning with an intense, agonizing shame that never truly faded. Desmond spent his days sitting on a sagging thrift store sofa, staring blankly at a small, crackling television screen, entirely broken by the sheer weight of his own cowardly complicity. They had sacrificed their own daughter, their integrity, and their entire future on the altar of fake high society prestige. They had desperately tried to steal my empire to fund their delusions. Now they had absolutely nothing but the suffocating four walls of their run-down apartment and the inescapable haunting memory of the exact moment they lost it all. 5 days had passed since the spectacular collapse of my former family. The chaotic noise of flashing sirens, screaming relatives, and shattered crystal had been entirely replaced by the serene, undisturbed tranquility of my Tuxedo Park villa. It was late afternoon, and the Atlanta heat was finally breaking, surrendering to a cool, gentle breeze that swept across the lush green canopy of the city. I was lounging comfortably on a plush custom-designed chaise beside my private infinity pool. The water was perfectly still, acting as a pristine mirror that reflected the vibrant orange and deep violet hues of the descending sun. Wore a simple, elegant silk robe, feeling the soft, expensive fabric against my skin. There was no tension left in my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for 32 years, trying to earn the love of people incapable of giving it, had been permanently lifted. I was entirely free. Resting on my lap was a thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the architectural blueprints for the Buckhead estate. The massive red brick mansion that had once stood as a monument to Valerie toxic vanity and my father pathetic cowardice was about to undergo a profound and permanent transformation. I had absolutely no desire to ever live in that house again, or sell it to another status-obsessed socialite looking for a trophy property. Instead, I had instructed my commercial real estate firm to officially transfer the deed to a newly formed nonprofit organization I fully controlled. We were entirely gutting the property. The grand dining room where Valerie had haughtily ordered me to sleep in a damp basement was being redesigned into a collaborative high-tech learning center. The expansive manicured backyard, where Jamal had been forcefully handcuffed against a catering table, would soon feature a community garden and an outdoor recreation area. The master suite that Trey and Raven had arrogantly attempted to demolish for their fictional royal baby was being converted into a state-of-the-art counseling and resource center. The entire estate was being transformed into a comprehensive, fully funded transitional shelter and educational hub for displaced minority youth in the greater Atlanta area. It was going to provide housing mentorship and financial literacy programs for young people who had been abandoned or marginalized by their own families. I traced my finger over the crisp blue lines of the architectural schematics, feeling a deep, profound sense of purpose. I was taking a space that had been built on exclusion cruelty and fake generational wealth and forcefully turning it into a beacon of genuine hope and community empowerment. The expansive gourmet kitchen where my family had plotted my financial ruin would now serve hot, nutritious meals to children who truly needed them. The grand foyer where Trey and Raven had arrogantly paraded their fraudulently acquired luxury vehicle would now welcome young scholars seeking a safe haven from the very streets my family currently inhabited. Every single time Valerie A. drove past their former kingdom, they would have to see disadvantaged teenagers thriving on the very lawns they used to aggressively guard. It was the ultimate poetic justice, a masterpiece of karmic rebalancing that no amount of petty revenge could ever equal. The absolute silence of my private oasis was gently interrupted by the soft glowing light of my encrypted smartphone resting on the marble side table. I did not immediately reach for it. I let it silently vibrate, watching the screen light up with incoming notifications. My legal team had successfully blocked all communication from my family-known numbers, but desperation breeds persistence. They had clearly purchased cheap prepaid burner phones to bypass the legal blockade. I picked up the sleek device and unlocked the screen. There were two new voice messages waiting in my inbox. I tapped the screen and put the phone on speaker, allowing their voices to echo across the empty, luxurious patio. The first message was from Desmond. The audio quality was terrible, filled with the harsh background noise of blaring highway traffic and roaring diesel trucks passing by his new dilapidated apartment complex. Simone, his voice crackled through the speaker, thick with heavy, pathetic tears. Simone, please pick up the phone. It is your father. I know you are angry. I know I failed you. I sit here in this terrible tiny room every single day, and I cannot stop thinking about how I let them treat you. I lost everything, Simone. My home, my friends, my reputation. I have absolutely nothing left but the clothes in my garbage bag. Please, sweetheart, I am begging you for a second chance. Just talk to me. We can go to counseling. I will leave Valerie if that is what it takes. Just please do not leave me to die in this awful place alone. You are my daughter. You are my only real family. Please call me back. The message ended with the sound of a grown man sobbing uncontrollably into the receiver. I listened to his desperate pleas with absolute cold detachment. 10 years ago, those tears might have broken my heart. I would have rushed to rescue him, handing over my hard-earned money to protect him from the consequences of his own weakness. But the woman who would have saved him died the moment he sat at that dining table and silently chewed his steak while his wife threw me out into the street. His apologies were entirely worthless because they were not born of genuine remorse. They were born of sheer, absolute desperation. He did not miss his daughter. He missed his comfortable lifestyle and the free roof I had secretly provided for him. The second message automatically began to play. It was Valerie. The stark contrast between the woman speaking on the recording and the arrogant high society queen who had paraded around in an emerald gown just 5 days ago was staggering. Her voice was completely broken, stripped of all its former elitist venom. It was hollow, shaky, and laced with the profound exhaustion of a woman who had hit rock bottom. Simone, Valerie whispered, her voice trembling so violently the microphone barely picked it up. I know you hate me. I know my lawyers told me not to contact you. But I have nowhere else to go. Jamal is gone. Renee will not even answer my calls. The retail store fired me today because a customer recognized me from the viral video and caused a scene. Desmond just stares at the wall all day. Simone, we do not have any food. The electricity bill is due tomorrow, and I do not have a single dollar to my name. I am so hungry. Please, I am not asking for the house back. I just need a small loan. Just a few $100s to buy groceries for the week. I will pay you back. I swear I will pay you back. Please, Simone, you won this. You beat me completely. Just please help us. The line went dead, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence. I sat perfectly still, looking out over the sparkling water of my infinity pool. Valerie, the woman who had demanded I pack my bags and move into a dark basement so her golden child could have better lighting, was now begging me for grocery money. She had openly mocked my existence, told her wealthy friends I was a pathetic failure, and orchestrated a massive federal fraud scheme to steal my entire corporate portfolio. Now she was literally starving in a cheap apartment, completely dependent on the mercy of the very woman she had tried to destroy. I looked down at the phone in my hand. I felt absolutely no obligation. I felt no lingering anger. The intense, burning resentment that had fueled me for so long had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated peace. I reached out and tapped the settings icon on my phone. I swiped the toggle switch, activating the Do Not Disturb feature. The screen went dark, permanently silencing their pathetic voices and blocking their desperate, chaotic energy from ever entering my sanctuary again. I picked up my crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux and reclined back into the soft cushions of my chaise lounge. The sun was finally dipping below the horizon, casting a magnificent fiery glow across the towering skyscrapers of the Atlanta skyline. The city was bustling with millions of people chasing wealth, status, and power, but I was completely removed from the rat race. I had already won the ultimate prize. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my wine, the rich, complex flavors perfectly complementing the absolute tranquility of the evening. I watched a flock of birds glide peacefully across the orange sky, realizing the profound truth of my journey. I had spent my entire youth trying to prove my worth to a group of individuals who were entirely devoid of personal value. They had confused material possessions with character and mistook loud arrogance for actual power. Society often tells us that we must forgive toxic family members to find peace, or that we must scream and fight to prove our worth in the face of absolute betrayal. But the reality is far more elegant and far more satisfying. The absolute best revenge is not aggressively destroying people. It is not plotting their downfall, orchestrating their public humiliation, or actively ruining their lives with malicious intent. The greatest, most devastating revenge is simply stepping aside, establishing unbreakable boundaries, and allowing their own toxic greed to dig their graves. You just have to build your empire, secure your peace, and wait in absolute silence. Because eventually, arrogant, entitled people who build their lives on fraudulent foundations will always destroy themselves. They will always take the bait. And when they finally trigger their own catastrophic collapse, you do not have to lift a single finger to help them or hurt them. You just sit back, pour yourself a glass of excellent wine, and enjoy the spectacularly beautiful view.